Pick up at verse 13 and read through to verse 21. Luke chapter 12, starting at verse 13, page 871 of the Bibles on the tables. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of one's possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops?' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store up all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God.'" Over to Chris.
It was John Davison Rockefeller who died in 1937 with a personal net worth of $340 billion. He's widely accepted as being the richest man in the modern era. I guess there are many in ancient days who had proportionally much more. His success was due to what was called at the time the Standard Oil Company. It was the sort of mother of all oil companies which spawned lots of the different companies that we know today, companies like BP and Exxon. They all had their origin in John Davison Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. And he was once asked towards the end of his life to give some advice on how to get rich. And he said, very easy, 3 simple rules of how to get rich. First, go to work early. Second, stay at work late. Third, find oil. Well, I remain pretty optimistic when it comes to most things, but I concluded that my chances of finding oil in the City of London were pretty slim. So I decided to ask ChatGPT for advice. And I typed this question into the search engine. What would be the best way for a Church of England minister to make £1 million in his spare time in the City of London in 2023? That was the exact question I put into ChatGPT. And as you'll know, if you haven't played with it yet, it is quite fun to play with, you know, the internet sort of artificial intelligence. It thought for 4 seconds, if thinking is the right word to ascribe to AI, and then the answer, well, let me quote the exact answer that it gave me. "I must advise that any financial advice provided is purely educational in nature and should not be construed as professional financial advice. That being said, as a general response to your question, it is not appropriate or ethical for a Church of England minister to use their position to make a large amount of money in the City of London." I think that means I just got told off by AI. It's hard, though, isn't it, sometimes not to be distracted by wealth, by cash, by career, by the prospects that are held out in front of you every day. We want more of what we don't have. How could we not? In a sense, that's what drives so much of the city around us. Well, in the passage today, Jesus explains 2 different approaches to life, 2 ways to live, I've called it at the top of the handout. What you may find interesting is that both the ways that Jesus outlines are about being rich. You'll see the 2 ways summarized in verse 21. "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So first, Jesus outlines the self-centered life, the one who lays up treasure for himself. That person that Jesus uses to capture and to explain the implications of this way in life, well, that's the main character of the parable. They are the rich fool. No prizes for guessing what Jesus thinks of that individual. Secondly, though, Jesus outlines the core characteristics of the alternative, the one who is rich toward God. And we'll think more about that when we come to it. Let me just say a few things about money or wealth, because I think it's fair to say, as I've already alluded, that most of the time, most of us assume that money and wealth is a strictly private matter, something to keep very, very tight to the chest. And what's interesting is the Bible doesn't really speak about money in those sorts of terms. I think that's more a product of our stage and our time. The Bible is much more open, more challenging, that perhaps we're comfortable about. And so we're going to be thinking a little bit about that as well as we go. But it should be said up front that the Bible never condemns wealth, nor does it condemn rich people for being rich. In fact, the Bible is stuffed full of lots of super rich people who are commended for their lifestyles and the ways that they use their money and their wealth and whatever it is. King Solomon, he had wealth which in proportion, valued at the day, would have made people like J.D. Rockefeller feel really quite small. And we mustn't forget, if you were here over Christmas, we considered the Magi, as we said at the time, undoubtedly the crazy rich Asians of their day. The Bible is not against rich people. So the application of passages on cash are always thought-provoking, and so we're going to have to consider what that might mean for us, whether we've discovered oil or not at this stage in our lives. So, first point there on the handout, the self-centered life, the self-centered life. By this point, Jesus' fame has drawn huge crowds. We get the idea from the way the text around this parable is constructed that the disciples are there listening in. Jesus frequently sort of has the crowd to deal with and then addresses the disciples with the crowd listening in. There's a lot of sort of interesting into sort of connections there. And Jesus has been warning everybody about the poisonous, the contagious words of the establishment. The lawyers, the Pharisees, the scribes. And then suddenly we get a change. 12 verse 13, where we began today, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Whoever the person in the crowd was had one thing on his mind. He'd had enough in terms of Jesus' instructions on the establishment, and he decided that he wanted to cut to what was important to him. He felt he was being cheated. And, as has been said famously before, when there is an inheritance, 99% of people become wolves. Verse 14, Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" Now, Jesus is not interested in becoming a local sort of magistrate in this family dispute. But it perfectly sets up the main thing that Jesus does want to do here. Jesus wants to direct everybody's attention towards the danger of leading a self-centered life. And it sort of fits with the flows of the argument quite well, actually. Jesus has been warning them about the establishment, particularly the hypocrisy, and now Jesus develops that into warnings about materialism, and one flows seamlessly from the other. And so, turning to the wider crowd, Jesus starts by exposing covetousness, and you'll see that sub-point there, coveting lots of stuff. Verse 15. Jesus said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all covetousness." The man wants more of what he hasn't got. That's what coveting is. And all of us can relate to that, I think, can't we? We can all relate to the idea of wanting more of what we haven't got. We engage subconsciously all the time with advertisers. We frequently give in to those advertisers. What we don't have becomes what we should have in our minds, and then what we must have. Undoubtedly, this strikes closer to the bone than perhaps we're prepared to admit. Go way back to the time of Plato. He said, "The desire of man is like a sieve or a pierced vessel, which he ever tries to and can never fill." Mark Twain. Civilization as a limitless multiplication of unnecessary necessities. Jesus explains why coveting is so incredibly dangerous. And to do this, Jesus shows us the super rich man of the parable. He's a made-up character, a hypothetical character, but he exposes the real danger of what happens when coveting is given into. You'll see the second bullet point there, getting lots of stuff. Verse 16. And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Raises the question, doesn't it? I mean, is this thoughtful, diligent planning? Could this not be explained as being a good steward? He had an opportunity, he was storing up. Well, no. As you read on, his motives are clearly exposed. Verse 19, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Our man wants barns so that he can store his goods to serve himself. You see, in the end, this guy is all about one person, himself. And the details of the text bring this to life. Look at verse 17. This is a parable. And yet, in the parable that Jesus tells, our super rich man takes over as the narrator, as the narrator, which shows sort of clear, increasing autonomy. Look at the end of verse 17. My crops. Verse 18. My barns, my grain, my goods. I mean, this man lives to serve himself. And again, verse 19 at the end. He says to himself, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. The easygoing life. It's hard, isn't it, when we're in the sort of full flow of busy city living. It's hard not to be intoxicated by the idea of early retirement, the idea of sort of 5-star room service comfort, other people serving us, taking things easy. In one of my first jobs before I was a minister, I was encouraged to sit down with a financial planner in my first few years of work, which I did. The first question I was asked, what age do you want to retire? And all I'm going to say in answer to that, I gave a clear answer at the time. Had I followed that advice and carried on that trajectory, I would have retired 3 years ago, which is quite a fun idea. Anyway, I didn't, and I'm not, as you can see. But here is the shock, the third subpoint. What happens then? Look at verse 20. God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? A fool. See, our man thinks he has it all, but he's just found out, of course, that his riches, his barns stuffed full of cash equivalent, they're no use to him. They can't help. Now, he's called a fool, and that's worth just sort of mulling on for a moment. I mean, a fool in the Bible, it's not a reference to mental ability. It's a reference to spiritual discernment. This man was a fool because he overlooked the importance of his soul. He placed importance instead on his body. That is a foolish thing to do. Verse 19, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. I mean, how could money, cash, which is material, be useful for a soul, which is spiritual? One of the major influences in C.S. Lewis's life, a man called George MacDonald. C.S. Lewis often refers to him as the teacher. He was his tutor as he grew up. He famously said this, you've probably heard this quote before. You do not have a soul, you are a soul, and you have a body. And it's so easy to get sort of soul and body confused, isn't it? I've got a ring box here, and a ring box has a ring in it. And it's very easy, isn't it? If that sort of represents a human being, it's very easy to get completely distracted by what we can see and touch, when actually what's important is what the body contains. The body contains a soul, as this box contains a ring? Well, very few people in our city, of course, understand that. And in the real world, one day, God says, your time's up. Verse 20, God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you." One commentator puts it like this: the soul which had opted and hoped for ease has now called for attention. There's something horribly ironic about verse 20, the way it ends. The things you have prepared, his life's work, everything that he put his energy into, his hope, those barns stuffed full of cash, whose will they be? You see, in the end, no matter how big your coffin, you can't take it with you. Look at the famous grave of Tutankhamun, stuffed full of all his possessions. And so Jesus spells out the alternative, not the self-centered life, but the God-centered life. And there's two subpoints here. Be on your guard and rich toward God. Be on your guard, verse 15. And Jesus said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." You see, to define life by possessions is so obviously a narrow and shallow existence. One commentator, I like this, puts it like this. Let me read. Few people think of the danger of getting rich. Most think that they become great just in proportion as they gather wealth. Yet never was there a more fatal error. A man is really measured by what he is, not by what he has. We may find a shriveled soul in the midst of great fortune and a noble soul in the barest poverty. A man's real life is what would be left of him if everything he has were stripped off. His real worth is his character as it appears in God's sight. We will make a great mistake if our goal in life is simply to gather more worldly trinkets than our neighbor. I mean, the obvious point, stuff will never satisfy. The liberating point, it was never meant to. You see, humanity was created for something much greater than stuff. It was created for a relationship with God. And to put our desire for God at the heart of our lives above all else, well, that's what Jesus came to enable. To covet is essentially to replace that desire for God with a desire for other things. We were designed to desire God, and we end up using our lives desiring anything else. Jesus says, be on guard. This word guard, that's the sort of the illustration that we're meant to have in our mind. A guard is stationed on the edge of a camp to protect the camp. At the first sign of danger, as the camp is threatened, the guard alerts the camp as to what's about to happen. The guard needs to be prepared to fight if necessary. And the point here is that don't make the mistake of thinking that the enemy will be a pushover. Jesus is saying, be on your guard. Be ready to take action. The fight against money is a truly spiritual battle. And instead, well, you see the alternative. Last bullet point there, be rich toward God. That's where the parable ends, isn't it? Verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. The fool lays up or stores treasure for himself. But the contrast, be rich toward God. I think this is quite a surprise. I think lots of people who'd heard that parable and didn't have the conclusion and were asked to sort of suggest what they thought Jesus might say in conclusion, they probably say something like, well, Jesus advises everybody to give their money instead to the poor. But that's not what he says at all. Giving away all your cash is not the primary challenge at all. Jesus is way more nuanced than some prosperity church where everyone is told to sort of empty their pockets. Look at the phrase again, last three words of the passage, rich toward God. To be rich toward God means making much of him, to think rightly of him, to arrange my life so that I'm rich toward him. By definition, if I am rich toward God, I must be being poor toward myself. And yes, that will impact everything. Not because Jesus is telling me to set up direct debits, but because I'll start to grasp, if I'm rich toward God, that it's only God that I can truly invest in. Only God lasts. And so the challenge is to use everything that God has entrusted to me, everything. My time, my skills, my career, my retirement, my family, my cash, for him and not for me. You see, we can't take our stuff with us. But here's the wonderful thing. We can send it on ahead. We can send everything that the Lord has entrusted to us on ahead to heaven. Let me try and illustrate this with a story of two men who worked together. They were good friends. They worked in the city in very lucrative careers. They climbed high up the career ladder and became very successful. Toward the end of his career, one of the two became a Christian. The other did not. The man who became a Christian decided to give up his job and go into the mission field. He decided he could best use the last sort of 10 or 15 years of his life effectively by telling other people about the gospel that he'd become so excited about. He went to tell other people about Jesus. These two men remained friends. As the years went on, the one who stayed in the secular workplace climbed higher and became incredibly rich. At a point not so long ago, they both became unwell and went into hospital. The daughter of the now missionary went to visit her father's old friend with only days left to live. And he said this, "You may wonder why I cannot be as happy and content as your father. But just think for a moment with the difference between us. He is going to his treasure, whereas I must leave all of mine behind." To be rich toward God. It's not just a challenge for rich people. This is for all of us, whatever has been entrusted to you. So here are a few points to mull on as we close. Firstly, we mustn't get body and soul confused. I think that's quite a challenge in our world, because I think essentially, whilst we may believe if we're Christians in the soul, we end up getting quite distracted by our bodies. I mean, imagine again, going back to this illustration of this, this is an illustration of a human being. The body you can see. The soul, of course, is hidden. But where's the value? I mean, imagine being given this and getting really excited and saying, what a beautiful box. I'm going to look after that box and nurture that box and take the box to the gym and do everything necessary to make this box beautiful. And miss the whole point of the fact that the body is there to carry your soul, which lasts for eternity. We mustn't get body and soul confused. Secondly, you don't have as long as you want. Look at verse 20. Verse 20 should alarm us. So let's close then. Thirdly, on what sending treasure on ahead would actually look like. I mean, I think that's something to really mull on. Isn't it wonderful to think, as we're rich toward God, we can send our treasure on ahead. Let me try and illustrate this from a film which I saw some time ago, Schindler's List. Don't worry too much if you haven't seen it. As I've asked around, pretty much everybody I've ever asked has seen this film, so I think it'll probably make sense to the majority of people. If not, I think you'll probably gather what's going on. Schindler's List. At this stage, the Second World War is over, and Mr. Schindler is leaving the many Jews whom he has saved by employing them in his munitions factory. By this stage in the film, he spent his entire personal fortune bribing German officials in order to save these Jewish people from the death chambers. But as he looks at them, he breaks down. He weeps, he laments, and he says to those with him, I could have done more. And they try and console him. You did so much. And he points to his nice car standing outside. And he says, I could have sold it. I could have sold it to save a few more lives. He then takes out of his pocket an expensive fountain pen, and he sort of shows his watch to those looking on, and he says, these could have been sold too. They could have been exchanged for more Jewish lives. Well, as we think about being rich toward God, as we really grasp the eternal worth of the soul, as we think about those people that we're about to go and rub shoulders with in our offices, our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors at home, what's going to drive us to want to share the gospel? What's going to drive us to want to use our skills, our time, the resources that have been entrusted to us for the eternal good of our soul and their soul? Well, there's only one motivation I'd like to suggest, and that motivation comes from Jesus himself. Think about what Jesus did. At this stage, as he tells the parable, he is walking intentionally straight to Jerusalem. He's going to Jerusalem to give up his life to die on a cross. Not for himself, but for us. Once we start to get to know him and value him and see what he is prepared to do with his body for the sake of our souls, well, that's the motivation we need to be rich toward God. There's a few things to think about in our lunch break together. I'm going to close in a short prayer, and then Tom's going to come and close our time together. Heavenly Father, please help us to put into practice the challenge. Please help us to be rightly motivated by what Jesus has done. We ask this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.